January 17th, 1945. Somewhere in Texas, the cellar smelled of damp earth and human fear. 11 women huddled in the darkness beneath a farmhouse they did not own in a land they did not know, waiting for monsters they had been promised would come. The youngest was 7 years old. The oldest was 63. Between them sat daughters and mothers, grandmothers, and wives, their bodies pressed together for warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The only light came from a single candle, its flame trembling with every footstep that creaked across the floorboards above. In the corner closest to the earthen wall sat Margaret Richter, 24 years old, once a student at Barnard College in New York City, once a girl who dreamed of becoming a journalist for the New York Times. Now she was something else entirely. Now she was an enemy alien, a prisoner, a woman waiting in darkness for whatever came next. Beside her, gripping her hand with fingers that felt like iron wrapped in paper, sat her grandmother, Wilhelmina Richter, 63 years old, a woman who had survived the First Great War as a nurse in Berlin, who had held dying soldiers in her arms and watched empires crumble to dust. A woman who had seen enough of the world to know exactly what men were capable of when no one was watching. In her other hand, hidden beneath the folds of her wool coat, Wilhelmina held a small glass vial. Inside was a white powder, rat poison, enough to kill all 11 of them if she dissolved it in water. The boots above them stopped moving. Wilhelmina leaned close to her granddaughter's ear. Her breath was warm against Greta's skin, but her words were ice. If they open that door and do what we know they will do, you drink first. Then give it to the children. I will go last. Greta wanted to argue. She wanted to say that this was madness, that perhaps they were wrong, that perhaps the Americans were not what Radio Berlin had promised. But she could not find the words. Because somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where hope used to live, she believed her grandmother might be right. The propaganda had been explicit. Dr. Goebbels himself had painted the picture in colors meant to freeze the blood. The Americans, he said, were not soldiers, but savages, racially polluted, vengeful beyond measure. They would do to German women what the broadcast claimed Soviet soldiers were already doing in the East. The whispers had become screams across the Reich. Better to die by your own hand than to face what was coming. Now the Americans were here. Their boots were walking on the floor above, and 11 women sat in a Texas cellar, one of them holding poison, all of them holding their breath. What happened next would haunt these women for the rest of their lives, but not in the way they expected. To understand the magnitude of that moment, to truly grasp the space between expectation and reality, we must first go back to a train car rattling through the darkness 3 days earlier, back to where this story truly begins. 72 hours before the cellar. A freight train somewhere in the American Southwest, 3 o'clock in the morning. The train had been moving for 5 days. 47 women and children sat on wooden benches inside a converted cattle car, their bodies swaying with every curve of the track. They had departed from New York City from the detention center at Ellis Island, where they had spent the past 2 years waiting for a war to end or a fate to be decided. No one had told them where they were going. No one had explained why they were being moved. The guards had simply appeared one morning, ordered them to pack their belongings, and loaded them onto trains heading west. West into nothing. West into the unknown. Greta Richter sat by a small window watching America roll past in the darkness. She could see nothing but shapes, the silhouettes of mountains, the shadows of desert, the endless, impossible vastness of a country she had once loved. She had arrived in America in 1939 when she was 18 years old. Her father, Heinrich, had been transferred to the German embassy in Washington as a cultural attaché, and the family had followed. Greta had enrolled at Barnard College that fall. She had studied American literature. She had read Fitzgerald and Hemingway and fallen in love with the rhythm of English sentences. She had walked through Central Park in autumn and believed she had found her home. Then Pearl Harbor happened. Then Germany declared war on America. Then everything ended. The FBI came to their apartment at 4 in the morning on December 12, 1941. They took her father first, dragging him out in handcuffs, while Greta screamed that there must be some mistake. Her mother collapsed from the shock and never truly recovered. She died of pneumonia in the Ellis Island Infirmary in the winter of 1943, her lungs filled with fluid and her heart filled with despair. Now only Greta and her grandmother remained. Wilhelmina had flown from Berlin before the war expanded, hoping to visit her daughter and grandchild. She never made it back. And now here they were rattling through the American night toward a destination that no one would name. Somewhere in the car, a woman began to read aloud from an old German newspaper. It was the last one they had received before being cut off from the outside world entirely. Her voice trembled as she spoke the words. In American detention camps, German women are treated as objects for the pleasure of guards. The Americans, those mongrels of mixed blood, have no concept of honor or morality. They form lines and wait their turn. No woman emerges from these camps with her dignity intact. Many do not emerge at all. The woman stopped reading. She could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Everyone understood. Greta looked at her grandmother. In the dim light from the window, she could see the old woman's face had turned to stone. Wilhelmina was remembering something. Something from long ago. Something she had never spoken of and never would. We should have stayed in Berlin, Wilhelmina whispered. At least there we knew what kind of death to expect. A child began to cry somewhere in the darkness. Then another. Soon the entire car was filled with the sound of weeping of mothers trying to comfort daughters they could not protect, of women facing a future they had been taught to fear more than death itself. Greta closed her eyes and tried to remember a different America, the America of hot dogs in Central Park, of jazz music floating from open windows, of professors who praised her essays and classmates who invited her to study groups. That America seemed like a dream now. A beautiful lie she had told herself before waking up to reality. The train rattled on through the night, carrying its cargo of fear toward a place called Camp Hearn. If you or your family members served in Texas during World War II, you may recognize some of what comes next. Many of you have shared incredible stories about this period in previous videos. Stories of fathers and grandfathers who worked in these camps. Stories that history books rarely tell. What you are about to hear is one of those stories. A story about the gap between propaganda and truth. A story about what happens when everything you believe turns out to be wrong. Today's story comes from a perspective we seldom hear. The women on the other side, the ones who were taught to see Americans as monsters, and the American soldiers who showed them what true strength really means. If you have not done so already, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what happens next will change how you think about the greatest generation and the values they fought for. Now let us return to Texas, to a camp that would become the site of one of the most remarkable transformations in American military history. Camp Hearn sat in the heart of Texas farmland, roughly 100 miles northwest of Houston. The land was flat and dry, dotted with mesquite trees and cattle ranches that stretched to the horizon. In summer, the temperature could reach 110 degrees. In winter blue, northers would sweep down from the plains and drop the mercury to freezing overnight. The camp had been built in 1942 to hold German prisoners of war. Thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy had passed through its gates working on local farms and construction projects while waiting for a war to end on the other side of the world. But by late 1944, the camp faced a new challenge. Across America, thousands of German civilians were being held in detention. Diplomats and businessmen, teachers and housewives, anyone with German citizenship who had been living in America when war broke out. Most were held at facilities like Crystal City in South Texas or Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Crystal City was overflowing. Ellis Island was designed for processing, not long-term housing. And so a portion of Camp Hearn was converted into what the military called a family section, a place to hold women and children who had committed no crime other than being born in the wrong country at the wrong time. Captain William Morrison was put in charge of this new section, 45 years old, a veteran of the First World War who had fought in France and seen what men could become when civilization collapsed. He had watched villages burn. He had seen things done to women and children that haunted him still 2 decades later. Morrison had requested this assignment specifically, not because it was easy, but because it was important. He believed that America was better than its enemies, that democracy meant something more than just a word, and that the true test of a nation's character was not how it treated its friends, but how it treated its enemies when no one was watching. What Captain Morrison had planned for these women would become one of the most controversial decisions of his military career. Some would call it treason, others would call it the most American thing anyone had ever done. But that confrontation was still weeks away. First, there was the matter of the cellar, the rat poison, and the breakfast that would change everything. The train arrived at a small station outside Camp Hearn just before dawn on January 15th. The women and children were loaded onto canvas-covered military trucks and driven the final miles to the camp. None of them knew what awaited them. None of them dared to hope. Greta remembered the moment the truck stopped and the canvas flap was pulled back. She remembered squinting against the sudden light, her eyes adjusting after days of darkness. She remembered expecting to see barbed wire and guard towers, machine guns and snarling dogs. What she saw instead made no sense. There were wooden cottages with red tile roofs. There was a playground with swings and a small merry-go-round. There was a vegetable garden freshly tilled with rows of stakes waiting for spring planting. In the distance, she could see what looked like a swimming pool, its water glinting in the early morning sun. "This is a trap," Wilhelmina whispered beside her. "They want us comfortable before they strike." The women were unloaded in silence. They stood in a cluster near the trucks, 47 souls pressed together like sheep awaiting the wolf. American soldiers stood at a distance, watching but not approaching. None of them raised their weapons. None of them shouted orders. Then one of them stepped forward. He was young, perhaps 26 or 27 years old, tall and lean with sandy hair and blue eyes that reminded Greta of Texas skies. He was chewing gum with a slow, casual rhythm, as if this were the most ordinary morning in the world. He looked at a piece of paper in his hand, then looked at the women, then tried to speak in what might generously be called German. "Guten Tag, nein, wait. Guten Morgen. Ich bin Sergeant Crawford." He paused, consulting his paper again. "Haben Sie Hunger?" "Are you hungry?" No one answered. 47 pairs of eyes stared at this American soldier, as if he had asked whether they would prefer to be executed by firing squad or hanging. He was asking if they were hungry. What kind of trap was this? The sergeant scratched the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. He tried again, this time in English, speaking slowly as if that would somehow make the words more comprehensible. "Ladies, I know you have been through a lot. I do not know what they told you about us, but I promise you on my mother's grave, nobody here is going to hurt you. We are just supposed to take care of you until the war is over." Greta understood every word. She had spent 2 years at an American college. Her English was better than most native speakers, but she could not bring herself to translate. Not yet. Not until she knew whether this was real or simply a more elaborate cruelty. The sergeant sighed. He looked back at his fellow soldiers, then at the women again. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. Hershey's. The wrapper was brown with silver letters. He held it up for the women to see, then unwrapped it slowly and took a bite. "See, not poisoned." He chewed, swallowed, smiled. He had a kind smile, Greta noticed, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "We have got breakfast waiting for you in the mess hall. Eggs, bacon, toast the works. But first we need to get you settled into your quarters." Still no one moved. Still no one spoke. In the silence, a small voice broke through. It belonged to Liesel Hartmann, 7 years old, blonde pigtails and enormous blue eyes that had seen far too much for such a young face. Mama Liesel whispered in German, pulling at her mother's coat. "What did he say?" "What is that brown thing he is eating?" Her mother Ingrid, 32 years old and exhausted beyond measure, tried to shush her. But Liesel had already slipped free. She was walking toward the American sergeant, her small feet carrying her across the gap between enemy and enemy. Sergeant Crawford knelt down to meet her at eye level. He broke off a piece of the chocolate bar and held it out. "Hey there, little one. You want some? It is called chocolate. Schokolade." Ingrid Hartmann screamed, "Do not take anything from them." "It is a trap," but Liesel had already taken the chocolate. She put it in her mouth, she chewed, her eyes went wide, and then she smiled. "Mama," she said, her voice filled with wonder, "it is good. It is so good, like nothing I have ever tasted." That moment, a 7-year-old girl eating chocolate from the hand of her supposed enemy would become the first crack in a wall of fear that had taken months to build. But the wall was far from broken, and what would happen at breakfast would test everyone in ways they could not yet imagine. The women were led to a large building at the center of the family section. The mess hall, the soldiers called it. When the doors opened, Greta had to grab her grandmother's arm to keep the old woman from falling. The smell hit them first. Bacon. Actual bacon frying in its own fat, the sizzle and pop of it, audible even from the doorway. Eggs cracking into hot pans, bread browning in toasters, coffee, real coffee, not the barley substitute that Germans had been drinking since 1942. The aroma was overwhelming, intoxicating, almost violent in its intensity. Greta had not smelled bacon since 1940. In Berlin, meat had become a luxury reserved for party officials and the very wealthy. At Ellis Island, they had survived on thin porridge and stale bread. The idea that this much food even existed seemed like a hallucination. Inside the mess hall, long tables were set with plates and utensils. At the far end, a buffet line stretched across the width of the room, and on that buffet was a feast that belonged in a dream. Bacon piled high on metal trays, strips of it glistening with fat and perfectly crisped at the edges. Scrambled eggs, mountains of yellow fluffiness, seasoned with salt and pepper. Fried eggs with yolks, still runny the way Greta's mother used to make them on Sunday mornings in another lifetime. Toast sliced thick next to tubs of real butter and jars of strawberry jam. Hash browns golden and crispy. Pitchers of fresh, squeezed orange juice, the pulp still visible through the glass. And coffee. Pot after pot of steaming black coffee, the smell of it alone enough to bring tears to the eyes of anyone who had gone without for years. On a separate table set slightly apart was a display that made several of the children gasp out loud. Chocolate bars, Hershey's, dozens of them stacked in a neat pyramid, cookies and candies and things that German children had only heard about in stories. No one moved toward the food. The 47 women and children stood frozen just inside the doorway, each staring at the buffet as if it were a coiled snake. This abundance, this impossible excess, could only be a trap. They had been taught this. They knew this. In their bones, they knew that no enemy would ever offer such generosity without expecting something terrible in return. From the kitchen, a man emerged. He was large. Not tall, but wide, with shoulders like a bull and hands that looked capable of crushing stones. His skin was deeply tanned, weathered by decades of Texas sun. A white apron stretched across his considerable belly, stained with grease and flour and evidence of hard work. His name was Tom Rodriguez. Everyone called him Big Tom, 52 years old, born in San Antonio to a Mexican mother and a Texan father. He had been cooking since he could reach a stove, and he had been feeding soldiers at Camp Hearn since the first prisoners arrived in 1942. Big Tom surveyed the frozen crowd of women and children. He had seen this before with the male prisoners. The disbelief, the suspicion, the certainty that kindness must be concealing cruelty. But somehow, seeing it in the eyes of mothers and grandmothers made it worse. He picked up a plate. He walked to the buffet line, slowly, deliberately making sure everyone could see. He filled the plate with bacon and eggs and toast. Then he sat down at one of the tables, picked up a fork, and began to eat. "See," he said between bites, his English accented with the musical lilt of his heritage. "Not poisoned. My mama would rise from her grave and beat me with a wooden spoon if I poisoned my own cooking." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that transformed his weathered face into something almost beautiful. "Eat, señoras. Eat, little ones. In this room, there is only one rule. You eat until you are full. No questions asked." Still the women hesitated. Wilhelmina's hand found the vial of poison in her pocket, her fingers closing around it like a talisman. "This is too much," she whispered to Greta. "No one gives away food like this, not in wartime, not to enemies." Greta did not answer. She was watching Liesel Hartmann, who had already broken free from her mother's grip once today. The little girl was staring at the pyramid of Hershey's bars with an expression of pure longing. Her small body was actually trembling. "Liesel, no, Ingrid," hissed, but Liesel was already moving. Her feet carried her across the mess hall floor, past the tables, past the buffet of bacon and eggs, straight to the chocolate. She picked up a bar with trembling fingers. She looked back at her mother, her face a mixture of defiance and desperation. Then she tore open the wrapper and bit down. The sound she made was not quite human. It was a moan of pure pleasure, the sound of a child tasting heaven for the first time. Chocolate smeared across her lips as she chewed, her eyes squeezed shut in concentration as if she were trying to memorize this moment forever. "Mama," she said, her voice thick with wonder. "You have to try this. You have to." Ingrid Hartmann stood paralyzed, caught between the instinct to protect her daughter and the evidence of her own eyes. Liesel was not dying, Liesel was not collapsing in agony from poison. Liesel was standing there with chocolate on her face, looking happier than she had looked in years. The spell broke. One by one, the children began to move toward the food. Their mothers tried to stop them, but hunger is stronger than fear, and these children had been hungry for so long. A boy of 10 grabbed a piece of bacon and stuffed it in his mouth. A girl of 12 poured herself a glass of orange juice and drank it in 3 desperate gulps. Within minutes, the buffet was surrounded by children eating with the frantic intensity of those who had learned not to trust that food would still be there tomorrow. The mothers followed slowly, reluctantly pulled forward by the sight of their children eating. They filled plates with trembling hands, still expecting at any moment for the trap to spring, for the soldiers to laugh and take it all away, for the nightmare to resume its natural course. But nothing happened. The soldiers stood at the edges of the room, watching but not interfering. Sergeant Crawford leaned against a wall, still chewing his gum, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Big Tom had returned to the kitchen, and Greta could hear him singing something in Spanish as pots clanged and stoves hissed. Wilhelmina was the last to move. She approached the buffet like a general surveying a battlefield, her eyes scanning for traps, for hidden dangers, for the catch that must certainly exist. She picked up a single strip of bacon with her fingers and examined it as if it might explode. Then she bit into it. The fat was perfectly rendered crispy at the edges, but still tender at the center. Salt and smoke and something indefinably American flooded her mouth. It was without question the best bacon she had ever tasted in 63 years of life. A tear rolled down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it away quickly, hoping no one had seen. But Greta had seen. And something shifted in her chest, some small piece of ice beginning to thaw. Her grandmother, the Iron Woman who had faced the horrors of one world war without flinching, was crying over a piece of bacon. What kind of enemy feeds you until you weep? Greta would spend the next several months trying to answer that question. And the answer, when it finally came, would change everything she thought she knew about America, about Germany, about herself. But that morning in the mess hall of Camp Hearns, surrounded by the smell of bacon and the sound of children laughing, for the first time in years, all she knew was this: something was not right with the story she had been told. The monsters were supposed to be cruel. The monsters were supposed to take what they wanted by force. The monsters were not supposed to hand out chocolate bars and fry bacon and tell you to eat until you were full. Either the propaganda had lied, or this was the most elaborate trap in the history of warfare. Greta looked at her grandmother, who was now cautiously adding eggs to her plate. She looked at Liesel Hartmann, whose face was smeared with chocolate and who was already reaching for a second bar. She looked at Sergeant Crawford, who caught her eye and gave a small nod as if to say, "See, I told you. Nothing to fear." And in that moment, in that mess hall filled with impossible abundance, Richter felt the first crack appear in the wall of fear she had been building for 3 years. It would take much more to bring that wall down completely. It would take the night of the generators. It would take a letter from her father. It would take watching her grandmother pour rat poison down a drain. It would take months of small kindnesses that added up to something revolutionary. But it started here, with bacon, with chocolate, with an American sergeant who spoke terrible German and smiled like he meant it. The next few hours would bring more surprises. The houses they would be assigned to, the beds with clean white sheets, the bathrooms with hot running water. Each revelation would chip away at what they thought they knew. But nothing would prepare Greta for what she would discover that night when darkness fell over Camp Hearn and she finally had time to think about what all of this meant. Because the question was not just whether the Americans were kind. The question was why. And the answer to that question would lead her down a path she never expected. A path that would take her from this mess hall in Texas to a newspaper office in New York City. From a frightened girl hiding in a cellar to a woman who would tell stories that changed how the world understood the greatest generation. That journey was just beginning. But first there was more bacon to eat. The cottage assigned to Greta and her grandmother was number 12. It sat in a row of identical wooden structures, each painted white with green shutters and a small porch facing the central walkway. From the outside, it looked like something from a postcard, a vacation cabin, a place where families might spend summer holidays fishing and swimming and forgetting the troubles of the world. Inside was even more bewildering. 2 bedrooms each with a proper bed and a mattress that did not sag in the middle. Clean sheets white as fresh snow stretched tight across the mattresses with military precision. Wool blankets folded at the foot of each bed. Pillows that were actually soft. A kitchen with a stove that worked with pots and pans hanging from hooks on the wall with a sink that produced water both hot and cold at the turn of a handle. And in the corner, humming quietly, stood a refrigerator. An actual electric refrigerator, the kind that Greta had seen in American advertisements, but never imagined she would use. She opened the refrigerator door and stared at its contents. Milk in a glass bottle, butter wrapped in wax paper, cheese yellow and firm, eggs arranged in a cardboard carton, a jar of strawberry jam with a checkered cloth lid. "This is more food than we had in a month at Ellis Island," Greta whispered. Wilhelmina did not respond. She was walking through the cottage like a detective searching for evidence, opening closets and checking under beds and peering into corners. Looking for microphones, perhaps, or hidden cameras, or whatever mechanism would spring the trap that must certainly exist. The bathroom stopped her cold. There was a toilet that flushed. There was a sink with a mirror above it, and there was a bathtub deep in white with a shower head attached to the wall and 2 handles marked H and C. Wilhelmina turned the H handle. Water emerged first cold, then warming rapidly until steam began to rise. She held her hand under the stream, feeling the heat against her palm, and her face did something Greta had never seen before. It crumpled, not into tears. Wilhelmina Richter did not cry, but her face crumpled inward, her features collapsing like a building whose foundations had suddenly given way. She turned off the water and stood there with one hand braced against the wall, breathing heavily. "Bowie," Greta said softly. "Grandmother, are you all right?" Wilhelmina straightened. The iron returned to her spine. When she spoke, her voice was flat and controlled. "This is how they break us. First they give us comfort, then they take it away. The fall will be harder because we have learned to hope." She walked out of the bathroom and sat on one of the beds. Her hand found the vial of poison in her coat pocket. She did not remove it, but Greta could see her grandmother's fingers curling around it, drawing strength from its presence. "I will not be fooled," Wilhelmina said. "I have lived too long and seen too much. This kindness is a weapon. I do not know how yet, but it is." Greta wanted to argue. She wanted to point out that they had been given food and shelter and hot water, that no one had threatened them or touched them or even raised their voice. But she knew her grandmother too well. Wilhelmina's beliefs had been forged in the fires of the First Great War, hardened by decades of watching the world prove her darkest expectations correct. A single morning of American hospitality would not change that. Instead, Greta said nothing. She walked into the bathroom and closed the door. She turned on the hot water and let it run. She removed her clothes garments she had worn for nearly a week straight and stepped into the stream. The sensation was almost painful. Hot water cascaded over her shoulders, down her back, across skin that had not felt truly clean in longer than she could remember. Steam rose around her, filling the small bathroom with warmth and moisture. She found a bar of soap on a small shelf and held it to her nose. Lavender. The smell hit her like a physical blow. Her mother had used lavender soap. Every Sunday in Berlin, before everything changed, her mother would draw a bath and add lavender oil to the water. The scent would drift through their apartment, mixing with the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs and the sound of church bells in the distance. Greta began to cry. She cried for her mother, dead in an infirmary on Ellis Island, buried in a grave that Greta had never been allowed to visit. She cried for her father, locked away in some camp in North Dakota, his fate unknown. She cried for the life she had lost, the future that had been stolen, the girl she used to be before the world went mad. She cried for herself, for the fear that had become her constant companion, for the nights spent wondering what would happen when the Americans finally decided to do what the propaganda promised, for the exhaustion of being perpetually afraid. The hot water washed her tears away, mixing them with soap and steam, carrying them down the drain and out of sight. When Greta finally emerged from the shower, wrapped in a towel that was white and soft and smelled of nothing but cleanliness, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt human again. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, water dripping from her hair, she asked the question that would haunt her for days to come. Why? Why would the enemy give her lavender soap and hot water? Why would they feed her bacon and eggs and chocolate? Why would they house her in a cottage with clean sheets and a working refrigerator? The propaganda said Americans were monsters. Monsters did not give their victims hot showers. Either the propaganda was wrong, or the Americans wanted something so terrible that they needed their victims comfortable and trusting first. Greta stared at her reflection and did not know which possibility frightened her more. To understand what happened in the days that followed, we must step outside the cottage and look at Camp Hearn from a different angle. We must see it through the eyes of the men who ran it, because they too were fighting a battle, though not the kind that involved guns and tanks. Captain William Morrison sat in his office, a converted supply room in the administrative building, and stared at a report on his desk. The report detailed the arrival of the 47 women and children, their assignment to housing, their consumption of breakfast that morning. It noted that one elderly woman had been observed concealing something in her coat pocket, possibly a weapon or contraband. Morrison knew what it was. His intelligence officer had briefed him. Rat poison. Enough to kill a dozen people. The captain was not surprised. He had seen the reports from the European theater. He knew what German propaganda was telling its citizens about American soldiers. He knew that women in the Eastern Territories were killing themselves and their children rather than face capture by the advancing Allies. The question was what to do about it. Some of his officers had suggested confiscating the poison by force, searching the woman and her belongings, removing the threat, asserting control. It was the military solution, the efficient solution. Morrison had rejected it immediately. If we take it by force, he told his staff that morning, we prove every lie they have been told about us. We become the monsters they expect. Instead, we will show them who we really are. We will give them no reason to use that poison. And eventually, when they understand that they are safe, they will get rid of it themselves. His officers had exchanged glances. Some of them thought their captain was naive. Some thought he was soft. A few, the ones who had seen combat and understood that war was not just about killing enemies, but about deciding what kind of people you wanted to be, thought he might be the wisest man they had ever served under. Morrison himself was not certain. He only knew that he had seen enough cruelty in his lifetime. In France in 1918, he had watched soldiers on both sides commit acts that still woke him, screaming in the night. He had promised himself then that if he ever had power over others, he would use it differently. Now he had power over 47 women and children who believed he was going to destroy them. What he did with that power would define not just his own soul, but his country's character. He picked up his pen and began to write orders. Extra rations for the family section, a doctor's visit for anyone who needed medical attention, school supplies for the children, seeds for a vegetable garden once the weather warmed. If we cannot convince them with words, he wrote in his personal journal that night, we will convince them with actions, every single day, until they have no choice but to believe. It was a gamble. Some would call it foolish. But Morrison believed in the idea of America more than he believed in the reality of any particular American. And the idea of America was not revenge. The idea of America was that all people deserve dignity, even enemies, even in wartime, even when no one was watching. Whether that idea would survive contact with reality remained to be seen. Sergeant James Crawford had his own reasons for being at Camp Hearn, and they had nothing to do with idealism. 6 months earlier, he had been on a beach in Normandy, D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944. He had jumped from a landing craft into water that turned red. Within seconds, had waded toward a shore that was exploding with machine gun fire, had watched friends he had trained with for 2 years torn apart before they reached the sand. He had killed men that day. Germans. Boys not much older than himself, wearing the wrong uniform, following orders from leaders who had led them into a war they could not win. He had shot them and stabbed them and beaten them with the stock of his rifle when his ammunition ran out. He had done things that he could not speak of, that he would never speak of, that lived in a locked room in his mind that he refused to open. A piece of shrapnel from an artillery shell had ended his combat career. It lodged in his left lung too close to the heart to be safely removed. The surgeons at the field hospital had done what they could, but they told him the truth. He would never fight again. His lung would only ever work at 60% capacity. Running would leave him gasping. Climbing would leave him dizzy. He was 27 years old and his war was over. They had sent him to Camp Hearn because it was quiet, guard duty, light work, a place to wait out the rest of the war while his buddies continued to fight and die across the ocean. Crawford had expected to hate it. He had expected to resent these German prisoners, these people whose countrymen had killed his friends and put shrapnel in his chest. He had expected to count the days until he could go home to San Antonio and try to forget that any of this had ever happened. But then he had met the prisoners, not the soldiers. He had guarded those too, and while some were hardened Nazis who sneered and spat, most were just tired men who wanted the war to end. Farm boys from Bavaria, factory workers from Hamburg, men who had been drafted into a cause they did not believe in and were secretly relieved to be out of the fighting. The women were different. The women were terrified. Crawford had seen terror before, in the eyes of French civilians when the Germans retreated through their villages, in the eyes of refugees flooding the roads with whatever possessions they could carry. But this was a different kind of terror. This was the terror of people who believed that the worst was yet to come, who were simply waiting for the moment when the mask would slip and the true face of their captors would be revealed. He thought about his grandmother, Elsa Crawford née Mueller, who had emigrated from Bavaria in 1890 and married a Texas rancher and raised 7 children in the hill country outside San Antonio. She had made the best schnitzel in the state, everyone said so, and she had sung German lullabies to Jimmy when he was small, and she had died the previous year while he was in England preparing for the invasion. He had not been able to say goodbye. He had not been able to attend the funeral. He had received the news in a telegram, just 2 paragraphs, and he had read it in his bunk and then gone out to the training field and practiced killing until his arms gave out. These German women were not his grandmother. He knew that, but they were someone's grandmother, someone's mother, someone's daughter, and they were looking at him with the same fear that haunted the eyes of refugees on French roads, the same certainty that something terrible was about to happen. He could not undo what he had done in Normandy. He could not bring back the men he had killed or the friends he had lost. But here in this strange corner of Texas, he could do something different. He could show these women that not all Americans were what their propaganda claimed. He could give a little girl chocolate and watch her face light up and feel something other than the numbness that had filled him since June. It was not redemption. Crawford did not believe in redemption, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. If you served in the military during World War II, or if your father or grandfather did, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What was it like to guard prisoners, to see the enemy up close, and realize they were human too? Many of you have shared powerful stories in previous videos about this very subject. Stories about fathers who came home changed by what they had experienced. Stories about the complicated emotions of seeing the enemy not as monsters, but as people. Please share your memories in the comments below. And if you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to like the video and share it with others who might appreciate this piece of history that is too often forgotten. Now let us return to Camp Hearn, because something is about to happen that will change everything. 3 days after arrival, a letter. Greta was sitting in the small library that had been set up in one of the administrative buildings. The collection was modest, mostly donated books from local churches and civic organizations, but it was more reading material than she had seen in 2 years. She had found a copy of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms and was slowly working through it, letting the English words wash over her like the hot water in her shower. A knock on the door made her look up. Sarah Mae Johnson stood in the doorway, 38 years old, the head nurse for the family section. She had red hair going gray at the temples and a face full of freckles in a Texas accent so thick you could spread it on toast. "Miss Richter, I have something for you." She held out an envelope. The paper was thin, almost translucent, covered with stamps and official markings. Greta's heart stopped when she saw the handwriting on the front. It was her father's. From the Red Cross, Sarah Mae explained. "Mail takes a while to get processed through all the sensors, but they try to forward everything eventually." She paused, her face softening. "I hope it is good news." Greta took the envelope with trembling hands. She did not open it. She could not. Not here, not with someone watching. She clutched it to her chest like a lifeline and walked out of the library without a word. She found a bench behind the vegetable garden, hidden from view by a row of young tomato plants. Her fingers shook as she tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My beloved daughter," the letter began. "I am writing to you from Camp Fort Lincoln in North Dakota. I am alive. I am healthy. I am being treated well. Greta had to stop reading. Tears blurred her vision. She wiped them away roughly and continued. The Red Cross has informed me that you and your grandmother are now in Texas at a similar facility. I hope this letter finds you safe. I hope you are not afraid. I know what the broadcasts from Berlin have said about the Americans. I know what you have been taught to expect. But I must tell you something, daughter. Something important. They are not what the propaganda claims. I have been at Fort Lincoln for nearly 2 years now. I have been treated with respect. I have been given adequate food and shelter. I have been allowed to read and write and even teach German classes to soldiers who wish to learn. No one has harmed me. No one has threatened me. The guards are not friendly, but they are not cruel. Greta, I know you are frightened. I know your grandmother is frightened, but I am asking you to do something difficult. I am asking you to open your eyes. Look at what is actually happening around you, not what you were told would happen. Trust your own observations, not the words of men in Berlin who have never met an American in their lives. I do not say this because I have forgotten what our country has done. I do not say this because I am naive about war. I say this because I have seen both sides now and I have learned something painful but true. Humanity is not limited by national borders. Good and evil exist in every country, including our own. Perhaps especially our own. I love you, daughter. I love your grandmother. We will see each other again when this madness ends. Until then, please take care of yourself. Please give these Americans a chance to show you who they really are. Your loving father, Heinrich Greta, read the letter 3 times. Then she pressed it against her chest and sat on that bench behind the tomato plants and let herself believe for the first time since December of 1941 that perhaps the world was not entirely made of darkness. Her father was alive, her father was safe, and her father, a man who had spent his career in the diplomatic service and knew more about international relations than anyone Greta had ever met, was telling her that the Americans could be trusted. It was not proof, it was not certainty, but it was a crack, another crack in the wall that had been built around her heart. She thought about Sergeant Crawford, who spoke terrible German and handed out chocolate to frightened children. She thought about Big Tom Rodriguez, who sang Spanish songs while cooking enough food to feed an army. She thought about Captain Morrison, whom she had never met, but whose orders had created this strange oasis of decency in the middle of a world at war. Could they all be pretending? Could this elaborate kindness be nothing more than a trap waiting to spring? Or was it possible, just barely possible, that her father was right? That night, Greta showed the letter to her grandmother. Wilhelmina read it in silence, her face giving nothing away. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and handed it back. Your father was always an optimist, she said. It is what made him a good diplomat, but optimism can be dangerous. It makes you vulnerable. He says they have treated him well for 2 years. Does that not mean something? It means they have not shown their true face yet. 2 years is nothing. I have seen kindness last for decades before the knife comes out. Greta felt frustration rising in her chest. But grandmother, what if there is no knife? What if this is simply who they are? Wilhelmina was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was tired. Not angry or defensive, just tired. Then I will have spent my whole life being afraid of shadows, she said. I will have wasted years of fear on enemies who did not exist. She looked at Greta, and in her eyes was something that might have been pain. I am not sure which possibility frightens me more. That admission, so small and yet so significant, was the second crack. 2 weeks after arrival, a storm. Texas weather was something none of the German women had been prepared for. The sky could change in minutes, clear blue, transforming into churning black without warning. Thunder rolled across the flatlands like artillery, and lightning split the darkness with violence that reminded them all too much of things they were trying to forget. The storm struck just after midnight. Wind screamed across the camp, rattling windows and tearing at roofs. Rain came down not in drops, but in sheets, horizontal and merciless. And then the lights went out. Greta sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Complete darkness. Not even the glow of a distant lamp. Just blackness and the sound of the storm, and her grandmother's breathing in the next room. Greta, Wilhelmina's voice sharp with controlled fear. I am here, grandmother, come to me. Greta made her way through the darkness, hands outstretched, until she found her grandmother sitting by the window. In the brief flashes of lightning, she could see Wilhelmina's face. The old woman was holding something in her hand, the vial of poison. "This is when they will come," Wilhelmina said. Her voice was steady, but Greta could feel her trembling. "In the darkness, when no one can see, this is when the true nature reveals itself. Grandmother, please. If you hear them coming, take this, drink first. I will be right behind you." Greta wanted to scream. She wanted to grab the vial and throw it across the room. She wanted to shake her grandmother until the old woman understood that this fear was killing them both more slowly, but just as surely as any poison. But before she could speak, she heard something. Not footsteps, not the sound of doors being broken down. Something else. The roar of machinery. Greta moved to the window and looked out. Through the rain, through the darkness, she could see lights moving. Flashlights. Dozens of them. And behind the flashlights, something large and mechanical being dragged through the mud. She heard voices, American voices, shouting to be heard over the storm. "Come on, boys, get that generator moving. Captain says the family section gets power first. Those women and kids need light. A generator." They were bringing a generator. In the middle of a storm, in the middle of the night, American soldiers were dragging heavy machinery through the mud so that German women would not have to sit in darkness. Greta watched as the soldiers struggled with the equipment. She could see Sergeant Crawford among them, soaking wet, his face twisted with effort as he pushed against the generator's weight. Other men she did not recognize were pulling ropes, hauling the machine toward the center of the compound. 10 minutes passed. 15. The soldiers worked in the rain without stopping, without complaining, without any of the cursing and shouting that Greta would have expected. They moved with the focused efficiency of men who had done difficult things before and would do difficult things again. Then the generator roared to life. Light flooded the compound. Not dim emergency light, but real light, bright and steady. The darkness retreated, and suddenly Greta could see everything. The other cottages with their windows glowing. The central pathway transformed into a river of mud, and the soldiers, drenched and exhausted, standing around the generator with expressions of satisfaction on their faces. One of them looked up. Sergeant Crawford. He was scanning the windows of the cottages, checking to make sure the power had reached everyone. His eyes found Greta's window, and he raised his hand in a small wave. Not a triumphant gesture, just an acknowledgement. "We did this. You are safe," Grandmother Greta whispered. "Come look." Wilhelmina moved to the window. She stood beside her granddaughter and watched as the American soldiers high-fived each other and began to disperse, some heading to barracks, others staying to monitor the generator. They were laughing now. Someone had told a joke, and even through the rain and the glass, Greta could see them shaking with laughter. "They could have waited until morning," Greta said. "They could have let us sit in darkness. No one would have blamed them. It is only one night." Wilhelmina did not respond. She was staring at the generator, at the light it produced, at the soldiers who had worked in a storm to bring it to life. Her hand was still closed around the vial of poison, but her grip had loosened. The light meant visibility, accountability. It meant that the occupiers were not afraid of being seen. And it meant that the women who had expected darkness and violence were instead given illumination and safety. This was the moment. Greta did not recognize it then. It would take her years to understand the significance of what she had witnessed. But this was the moment when everything changed. Not in a flash of revelation, but in the slow, quiet understanding that comes when reality persistently contradicts expectation. Wilhelmina stood at that window for a long time. The storm continued to rage outside, but the light held steady. The generator hummed its mechanical lullaby, and the darkness did not return. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "They could have done anything," she said. "In the darkness, in the chaos. No one would have known. No one would have stopped them. But they brought light instead," Greta said. "They brought light instead." Wilhelmina looked down at the vial in her hand. Such a small thing, a few grams of white powder in a glass container. For weeks it had been her security, her guarantee that she would not have to endure what she feared most. It had given her a sense of control in a situation where she had no control at all. But now, looking at that light, listening to that generator, she felt something she had not felt in months. She felt foolish. The vial was not security, it was surrender. It was allowing the lies of the Nazi propaganda to win even from thousands of miles away. It was killing herself and her granddaughter, based on nothing but fear and rumor, and the words of men who had never met an American in their lives. She thought about her son Heinrich, sitting in a camp in North Dakota, writing letters about kindness and humanity. She thought about the little girl Liesel eating chocolate with her face smeared in joy. She thought about the bacon and eggs and coffee, the hot showers and clean sheets, the small daily kindnesses that added up to something revolutionary. And she made a decision. "Greta," she said, "follow me." Wilhelmina walked to the bathroom. She turned on the light, that beautiful electric light powered by a generator that American soldiers had dragged through a storm. She held the vial over the sink. "Grandmother." "I was wrong," Wilhelmina said. The words seemed to cost her something. 63 years of learning to distrust the world, 63 years of being proved right again and again, all of it being challenged by men who brought light instead of darkness. "I was wrong. Not about everything, not about the evil that humans can do, but about these people, about this place." She opened the vial and poured its contents into the sink. The white powder swirled against the porcelain, mixed with water, and disappeared down the drain. Gone. Destroyed. The death that Wilhelmina had carried in her pocket for months washed away like a bad dream. Greta watched the poison vanish and felt tears sliding down her cheeks. This time she did not wipe them away. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, grandmother." Wilhelmina turned off the faucet and gripped the edge of the sink. Her shoulders were shaking. "Do not thank me," she said. "I should have done this weeks ago. I should have trusted your father. I should have trusted you. Instead, I let fear make me into something I am ashamed of. You kept us safe. You did what you thought was necessary. I kept us afraid. There is a difference." They stood in that small bathroom, grandmother and granddaughter, illuminated by electric light, surrounded by the sound of rain and the distant hum of the generator. Something had ended. Something had begun. Wilhelmina turned to face Greta. In her eyes was a vulnerability that the younger woman had never seen before. Always the iron grandmother, the unshakable matriarch, the woman who had survived wars and losses and disappointments without breaking. Now she looked old, tired, human. "I have spent my whole life preparing for the worst," Wilhelmina said, "and perhaps that kept me alive, but it also kept me from living." She reached out and touched Greta's face, a gesture so tender that it made Greta's breath catch. "You have your whole life ahead of you. Do not spend it the way I spent mine. Do not let fear become your prison." "I will try," Greta said. "That is all I can promise. That is enough. That is more than enough." The storm continued outside, but inside the cottage there was peace. For the first time since arriving at Camp Hearn, Greta and her grandmother sat together without the weight of hidden poison between them. They drank tea made from the supplies in their kitchen. They listened to the generator humming in the distance. They talked about Heinrich and about the future and about what it might mean to start again. When Greta finally went to bed that night, she slept deeply and without nightmares for the first time in years. The next morning, Wilhelmina did something extraordinary. She walked to the mess hall alone, filled a plate with bacon and eggs and toast, and ate breakfast in full view of the American soldiers. When Big Tom Rodriguez came out of the kitchen to check on the food, she stood up and walked over to him. "Excuse me," she said in halting English that Greta had been teaching her. She held out a piece of paper with words carefully written in pencil. "I want to bake for the soldiers, to say thank you for the light." Big Tom looked at the paper, then at the old woman, then back at the paper. His weathered face broke into a smile so wide it seemed to transform him entirely. "Senora," he said, "you want to use my kitchen? You are welcome anytime. What do you want to make?" Wilhelmina smiled back. It was a small smile, cautious, unpracticed, but it was real. "Apfelstrudel," she said. "Apple strudel, my grandmother's recipe from Bavaria." Big Tom's eyes lit up. "My abuela made strudel too," he said. "She called it something different, but same idea. Apple cinnamon, lots of butter." "Yes," Wilhelmina said, "lots of butter." They stood there, the German grandmother and the Mexican Texan cook, united by the universal language of pastry, and somewhere in that moment another crack appeared in walls that had separated enemies for generations. The strudel would come later that week. Wilhelmina would spend an entire afternoon in Big Tom's kitchen, teaching him her techniques while he taught her his, the two of them communicating in a mixture of broken English and hand gestures, and the shared understanding of people who knew that food was more than sustenance. When the strudel emerged from the oven, golden and fragrant with a cinnamon and caramelized apple, Wilhelmina cut it into squares and arranged them on a tray. She walked to the administrative building where the American soldiers gathered during their breaks. Sergeant Crawford was there. Captain Morrison was there. A dozen other men whose names she did not know, but whose faces she had begun to recognize. "For you," Wilhelmina said, holding out the tray. "For the light, for the chocolate, for everything." Sergeant Crawford took a piece. He bit into it and his eyes closed with pleasure. "Ma'am," he said, "this tastes just like my grandmother used to make." "How is that possible?" Wilhelmina's smile grew wider. "Good food," she said. "No borders." It was not eloquent. It was not a grand philosophical statement about the nature of humanity or the possibility of reconciliation between enemies. It was just an old woman sharing pastry with young men who had shown her kindness. But sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything. The days that followed would bring more changes, more revelations, more cracks in walls that had seemed permanent. There would be letters and conversations and small moments of connection that added up to something neither side had expected. But the foundation was laid that night. In the darkness of a Texas storm, when American soldiers chose to bring light instead of fear, something fundamental shifted. Not just in Wilhelmina, not just in Greta, but in the space between people who had been taught to hate each other. That space was still wide. It would take months to close. But for the first time, closing it seemed possible. Impossibility, as Greta would later write in her memoirs, is where everything begins. The weeks that followed the night of the generators brought changes that no one could have predicted. Wilhelmina Richter, the woman who had carried rat poison in her pocket and prepared to die rather than face American cruelty, became a regular presence in Big Tom Rodriguez's kitchen. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, she would walk to the mess hall, tie an apron around her waist, and spend hours creating pastries that her grandmother had taught her to make in Bavaria 60 years earlier. Apfelstrudel was only the beginning. There was Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, the Black Forest cake that required real cherries and chocolate and patience. There was Bienenstich, the bee sting cake with its honey almond topping and vanilla custard filling. There was Streuselkuchen, the crumb cake that Wilhelmina's mother had baked every Sunday morning before church. Big Tom learned every recipe. He wrote them down in a notebook that he kept in his apron pocket, asking questions, taking notes, treating each lesson as if he were learning sacred knowledge passed down through generations, which in a way he was. In exchange, he taught Wilhelmina the secrets of Texas barbecue, how to smoke brisket low and slow until the meat fell apart at the touch of a fork, how to make cornbread that was crispy on the outside and tender within, how to fry chicken in cast iron until the coating crackled and the juice ran clear. They communicated in broken phrases and hand gestures and tastes and smells, and the universal language of people who understood that food was love made visible. And slowly, through flour and sugar, and hours spent side by side, something remarkable happened. They became friends. Not friends in the way that word is often used casually and without weight. Real friends, the kind who could sit in comfortable silence, the kind who knew each other's stories, each other's losses, each other's fears. Wilhelmina learned that Big Tom had lost his son in the Pacific, a Marine killed on some island whose name she could not pronounce. Big Tom learned that Wilhelmina had lost her husband in the First War, her daughter to pneumonia, her country to madness. They were both survivors. They both knew what it meant to keep living when the people you loved did not. One afternoon in late March, as they were preparing bread dough together, Wilhelmina said something that surprised them both. "You remind me of my husband," she said. Her English had improved dramatically over the weeks. Not in appearance. He was thin, you are not. But in here, she touched her chest. The same kindness, the same patience, the same way of making people feel safe. Big Tom stopped kneading. His large hands rested on the dough, still and quiet. "That is the nicest thing anyone has said to me in a long time, Senora." Wilhelmina smiled. "It is the truth. I do not give compliments I do not mean." From that day forward, they called each other by their first names. Tom and Mina, two people from different worlds who had found common ground in a kitchen in Texas. Greta watched her grandmother's transformation with wonder and something like hope. The Iron Woman was softening not into weakness, but into something stronger. Flexibility instead of brittleness. Openness instead of fear. It was like watching a plant that had been kept in darkness finally find the sun. She was changing too. The vegetable garden behind the compound had become her sanctuary. Every afternoon, she would find Sergeant Crawford there, tending to the tomato plants that were now sprouting green shoots despite the lingering winter chill. They worked together in companionable silence, pulling weeds and checking for pests, and discussing the mysterious alchemy by which seeds became food. Crawford talked to her about his grandmother, the Bavarian woman who had come to Texas in 1890 and never looked back. He talked about growing up on a ranch outside San Antonio, about riding horses before he could walk about the way the Texas sky stretched from horizon to horizon and made you feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time. Greta talked about Berlin before the war, about the cafes where intellectuals argued philosophy over coffee, and pastry about the museums, where she had spent hours staring at paintings that seemed to contain entire universes. She talked about Barnard College and her dreams of journalism, about the professors who had encouraged her writing, and the classmates who had become friends before becoming strangers overnight. They did not talk about the war, not directly. It was too large, too present, too painful. But it was there in everything they said, a shadow that colored every conversation. One afternoon in early April, as they were planting a new row of beans, Crawford stopped working and looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" Miss Richter Greta had told him to call her Greta weeks ago, but he persisted with the formality. Southern manners, he called it. "Of course. What did they tell you about us before you came here?" "What did the propaganda say?" Greta was quiet for a long moment. She had been dreading this question. Answering it meant acknowledging the fear that had consumed her, the poison her grandmother had carried, the certainty that these Americans were monsters wearing human masks. "They told us you were savages," she said finally, "that you had no honor, no morality, no restraint, that you would do to German women what the Soviets were doing in the East, that it was better to die than to be captured by you." Crawford absorbed this without visible reaction. Then he nodded slowly. "I figured it was something like that," he said. "The way y'all looked at us when you arrived, like we were about to tear you apart. Were you not?" The question hung in the air between them. Greta had not meant to ask it so directly, but there it was. The fear she had carried for so long, finally given voice. Crawford looked at her with those Texas sky eyes, and she saw something in them that she had not expected. Pain. Not the pain of accusation, but the pain of being seen as something he was not. "Miss Richter," he said slowly, "I have done things in this war that I am not proud of. Things that keep me up at night. Things that will haunt me until I die." He paused and his jaw tightened. "But I have never hurt a woman who was not trying to kill me. I have never hurt a child. And I never will. Not because someone is watching, not because of military law, because that is not who I am. That is not who my mama raised me to be." Greta felt something release in her chest, a knot that had been there so long she had forgotten it existed. "I believe you," she said, and she realized with surprise that she meant it. Crawford smiled, then a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes, but was genuine nonetheless. "That is the first time anyone from your group has said that to me," he said. "It means more than you know." They returned to their planting, working side by side in the Texas afternoon, two people from opposite sides of a war, finding common ground in dirt and seeds and the promise of growth. The news came over the radio on May 8, 1945. Germany had surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The war in Europe was over. The entire camp gathered around the radio in the administrative building to hear the announcement. American soldiers and German civilians stood in the same room listening to the same words, experiencing entirely different emotions. For the Americans, it was victory, relief, the knowledge that their friends and brothers fighting across the ocean would soon be coming home. For the Germans, it was something more complicated. Defeat, yes, but also release. The end of a regime that had brought their country to ruin. The end of a war that had destroyed everything they had known. Greta stood beside her grandmother, listening to the announcer's voice crackling through the speaker. Around her, American soldiers were restraining their celebrations, conscious of the German women in the room. No one cheered, no one shouted in triumph. They simply listened, and when the announcement ended, they began to file out quietly. Sergeant Crawford passed by Greta on his way to the door. He paused, meeting her eyes. "I know this is a hard day for you," he said quietly. "I am sorry for what has happened. To your country, to your people. War is terrible for everyone." "Are you not happy?" Greta asked. I am happy that the killing will stop. I am not happy about the dead. He looked away towards some middle distance that only he could see. Nobody should be happy about the dead, no matter which side they were on. Then he was gone and Greta was left standing beside her grandmother in a room that was slowly emptying. It is over, Wilhelmina said. Her voice was flat, empty of emotion. The Germany we knew is gone. Greta took her grandmother's hand. It was cold despite the warmth of the room. Perhaps something better will grow in its place, she said. Perhaps, Wilhelmina did not sound convinced. Or perhaps it will be worse. History does not always move forward. They walked back to their cottage in silence, passing American soldiers who nodded respectfully but did not engage. The camp felt different now, quieter, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was the news from Europe. It came in pieces over the following weeks. First rumors, then photographs, then undeniable evidence of something so terrible that Greta could not process it at first. The camps. Not prisoner of war camps like Camp Herne, but something else entirely. Extermination camps. Places with names that would become synonymous with evil. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen. 6 million Jews, murdered systematically by the government that Greta had grown up under. Men, women, children, entire families wiped from existence. And along with them millions of others. Roma and Sinti people, disabled people, political prisoners, homosexuals, anyone who did not fit the twisted vision of those in power. Greta saw the photographs in the camp library laid out on a table with other newspapers and magazines that detailed the liberation of the camps. She stood there for what felt like hours looking at images of skeletal bodies, stacked like cordwood of survivors with hollow eyes, and numbered tattoos of mass graves that stretched beyond the frame of any camera. This was what Germany had done. This was what her country, her people, her nation had accomplished while she was worried about her own survival. She stumbled out of the library and found a bench behind the vegetable garden. She sat there shaking, unable to form coherent thoughts. The world had tilted on its axis and she could not find her balance. Sarah Mae Johnson found her there an hour later. The nurse sat down beside her without speaking, just a presence, a witness to grief that had no adequate expression. How could we not know, Greta whispered finally. How could we not see what was happening? Sarah Mae was quiet for a long moment before responding. Honey, terrible things can happen right in front of us, and we do not see them. Not because we are blind, but because seeing them would require us to do something. And doing something is hard. It is easier to look away. I should have done something. What could you have done? You were a child when it started, a young woman when it ended. What power did you have against an entire government, an entire military, an entire nation gone mad? Greta shook her head. She did not have an answer. She was not sure there was an answer. Sarah Mae reached out and took her hand. Let me tell you something, Miss Richter. My grandfather owned slaves before the Civil War. He bought and sold human beings like they were cattle. Greta looked up, startled by this confession. Does that make me responsible for slavery? Sarah Mae continued. Does it mean I carry the guilt of what he did? No, but that is different, is it? Sarah Mae's eyes were kind but unwavering. The best thing you can do now is not carry the guilt of people who made choices you did not make. The best thing you can do is live your life in a way that makes sure it never happens again. Learn from it. Teach others about it. Make sure the world remembers. That is how you honor the dead, not by destroying yourself with guilt, but by building something better. Greta sat with those words for a long time after Sarah Mae left. She thought about her father who had helped Jewish families escape Berlin before the borders closed. She thought about her mother who had organized secret collections of food and clothing for refugees. She thought about her grandmother who had spent her career as a nurse saving lives regardless of nationality or religion. Her family had not been monsters. They had been people flawed and frightened and doing what they could in impossible circumstances. Perhaps that was all anyone could be. That night, Greta began to write, not a letter, not a diary entry, but something larger, a record of what she had experienced. The fear on the train, the cellar and the poison, the chocolate and the bacon, the night of the generators and the morning after. The slow, painful process of learning that enemies could be human. She did not know what she would do with these words, perhaps nothing, Perhaps they would sit in a notebook until they yellowed and faded, read by no one, remembered by no one. But she wrote them anyway. Because Sarah May was right. Remembering was a form of resistance, and Greta was not ready to surrender. If you have stayed with this story until now, I want to thank you. What you are about to hear is the rest of Greta's journey, the part that history books rarely tell, the part that shows us how one moment of kindness can echo across decades. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. What do you think the legacy of the greatest generation should be? What lessons from their time should we remember today? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have not already, please subscribe and share this video with someone who might appreciate this piece of forgotten history. Stories like this need to be told, and you can help make that happen. Now let us jump forward in time, 20 years forward to a very different world. 1965, New York City. The woman who sat in the corner office of the New York Times building bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had huddled in a Texas cellar 2 decades earlier. Margaret Richter was 44 years old now. Her hair, once dark brown, was streaked with gray that she refused to dye. Her face carried lines that spoke of years spent chasing stories in difficult places. Her eyes, though, were unchanged, still sharp, still curious, still hungry for truth. On the wall behind her desk hung photographs that documented a remarkable career. Greta interviewing Martin Luther King Jr. during the Montgomery bus boycott. Greta standing before the Berlin Wall, notebook in hand, capturing the moment when a city was divided. Greta receiving the Pulitzer Prize for her series on refugee experiences during the Hungarian Revolution. She had become exactly what she had dreamed of becoming before the war interrupted everything. A journalist, a storyteller, a witness to history. But today she was not writing about kings or walls or revolutions. Today she was writing about something closer to home. The manuscript on her desk was nearly complete. 200 pages of memories carefully researched and painfully honest. The story of Camp Hearn and what had happened there. The story of fear and transformation, of enemies becoming friends, of a grandmother who poured rat poison down a drain and learned to bake strudel for American soldiers. The story of how everything she had been taught turned out to be wrong. Greta picked up her pen and wrote the final paragraph. In the darkness of that Texas cellar, I learned the most important lesson of my life. That strength does not require cruelty. That victory does not require annihilation. That a society built on freedom and plenty can afford to treat even its defeated enemies with dignity. The American soldiers who guarded us at Camp Hearn were not saints. They were ordinary men. Farmers' sons, factory workers, school teachers in uniform. But they chose every single day to be decent. And in that choice, they showed me what true strength looks like. They showed me what America at its best can be. She set down the pen and looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, her grandmother had lived her final years. Wilhelmina had passed away in 1960 at the age of 79 in a small apartment in Queens that smelled of cinnamon and apples. Her last words had been in German, a lullaby that her own mother had sung to her in Bavaria a lifetime ago. Greta had held her hand as she went. It had seemed fitting. They had entered America together, terrified and desperate, and they had built new lives together, slowly and painfully. Wilhelmina had never fully lost her caution, her wariness of the world. But she had learned to bake again. She had learned to trust again. She had learned in her own stubborn way to live again. That was enough. That was more than enough. A knock on the door interrupted her reverie. "Miss Richter, there is a phone call for you. Someone named Crawford. Says he knew you during the war." Greta's heart stopped for a moment, then resumed at twice its normal speed. James Crawford, Sergeant Jimmy Crawford of the Tomato Garden and the Terrible German and the chocolate bars for frightened children. She had not spoken to him in 20 years. She had not known if he was alive or dead, married or single, still in Texas, or scattered to the winds like so many others from that time. "Put him through," she said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were shaking. The phone clicked. A voice came through, older and rougher than she remembered, but unmistakably his. "Miss Richter, this is Jimmy Crawford. I do not know if you remember me." Greta laughed, a sound that surprised her with its warmth. "Sergeant Crawford, of course I remember you. You taught me how to grow tomatoes." A pause, then a chuckle that carried the dust of Texas roads and the echo of years gone by. "Well now," he said, "I am glad someone remembers the important things." They talked for an hour. Crawford was still in Texas running the family ranch outside San Antonio. He had married after the war, had 3 children, had buried his wife to cancer just 2 years earlier. He had thought about Greta over the years, wondered what had happened to the young German woman who spoke perfect English, and asked questions that made him think. I read your articles sometimes, he said, in the papers. You became exactly what you wanted to become. I almost did not, Greta said. Without Camp Hearn, without what happened there, I might have spent my whole life afraid. You helped change that. I did not do anything special. Just treated people like people. That should not be remarkable. But it was. That is what you do not understand. In a world full of cruelty, choosing kindness is the most remarkable thing anyone can do. Silence on the line. When Crawford spoke again, his voice was thick. I have thought about that time a lot, he said. About those women who came off the train looking at us like we were monsters. About your grandmother with that poison in her pocket. Sometimes I wonder if we really made a difference or if it was all just a drop in the ocean. You made a difference to me, Greta said. To my grandmother. To every woman and child in that camp. We expected hell, and you gave us heaven. That matters. That will always matter. They made plans to meet. Crawford was coming to New York the following month, visiting his oldest daughter, who had moved there for work. They would have dinner. They would talk about old times and new times and everything in between. When Greta hung up the phone, she sat for a long moment in the fading afternoon light. The manuscript on her desk seemed more important now than it had an hour ago. This story needed to be told. Not just for her, not just for her grandmother, but for everyone who had been part of it. For Crawford and Big Tom and Sarah May and Captain Morrison. For the American soldiers who had chosen decency when they could have chosen cruelty. For the German women who had learned to see beyond their fear. She picked up the phone and called her editor. I have something, she said. Something personal. I think it is ready. The dinner was in a small Italian restaurant in Greenwich Village. Nothing fancy, just red check tablecloths and candles and wine bottles, and food that reminded both of them of simpler times. Crawford looked older, of course. 51 now, his sandy hair gone mostly gray, his lean frame thickened by years of good eating and hard work. But his eyes were the same. Texas, sky blue. Kind and steady and utterly without pretense. They talked for 3 hours. About Camp Hearn and what had happened there. About their lives since then. About children and careers and losses and gains. About the strange path that had led from a vegetable garden in Texas to an Italian restaurant in New York. Over coffee, Crawford reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small glass jar. Inside were dried seeds, brown and wrinkled with age. These are from the tomatoes we grew together, he said. I have kept them all these years, replanted them every season. They are the great-great-grandchildren of those original plants. Greta took the ring, turning it in her hands. Such a small thing. Seeds. The promise of growth, of continuity of life persisting across time. Why did you keep them? Crawford shrugged, but his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. I am not sure, he said. At first it was just habit. Then it became ritual. And somewhere along the way it became something more. He paused, searching for words. Those tomatoes reminded me that good things can grow even in hard times. That people who are supposed to be enemies can plant seeds together and watch them become something beautiful. Every time I harvested them, I thought about you and your grandmother and all those scared women who learned to trust us. I thought about how things could have gone differently and how glad I am that they did not. Greta held the jar of seeds, and for a moment she was 24 again, kneeling in Texas dirt with her hands deep in soil, listening to a young sergeant talk about his grandmother's schnitzel and wondering if the world could ever make sense again. I want you to have them, Crawford said. You are writing the story. These seeds are part of it. Plant them somewhere. Let them grow. Let them remind you of what is possible when people choose to be kind. Greta looked at the man across the table, the enemy who had become a friend, the soldier who had taught her that strength and gentleness could coexist. Thank you, she said, for the seeds, for everything. Crawford smiled, and in that smile was the echo of a young man handing chocolate to a frightened child. Thank you for believing me, he said. That day in the garden, when I told you I would never hurt you, you believed me. That meant everything. They parted on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, promising to stay in touch, knowing that they would. Some connections transcend time and distance and all the barriers that history throws between people. Greta walked home through the New York night, the jar of seeds in her purse feeling lighter than she had in years. Tomorrow she would deliver her manuscript to her editor. Soon the world would read her story, would know about Camp Hearn and the women who expected monsters and found men instead. But tonight she just walked, through streets that had become home, under lights that never went out, thinking about generators and Texas storms and the simple revolutionary act of choosing light over darkness. There is a photograph in the National Archives taken in the spring of 1945 at Camp Hearn, Texas. It shows a group of German children surrounding an American soldier. He is handing out chocolate bars. The children are smiling, tentative, uncertain smiles, but smiles nonetheless. They are reaching for the chocolate with hands that have forgotten how to trust, remembering how to hope. In the background, a woman watches. Her face is unreadable. She holds a white cloth in her hands, perhaps a flag of surrender, perhaps just laundry. Her posture speaks of exhaustion and weariness and something else, something that might be the beginning of belief. The soldier is not looking at her. He is focused on the children, his rifle slung over his shoulder, pointed at the ground. His face is patient and kind, the face of someone who understands that earning trust takes time. This is not a moment of triumph. It is not a moment of defeat. It is something rarer and more precious than either. It is a moment of transformation. The slow, painful, beautiful process by which enemies become human to each other, by which propaganda dissolves in the face of lived reality, by which fear makes way for something better. Greta's book was published in the fall of 1970. It was called The Light in the Cellar, and it told the story of 11 women, a vial of poison, and the American soldiers who changed everything by simply being decent. The reviews were mixed at first. Some critics called it naive, a whitewashing of American history that ignored the nation's many failures and cruelties. Others called it sentimental, a story too hopeful for a world that had seen too much horror. But the readers understood. Letters poured in from across the country. From veterans who had served in camps like Hearn and never spoke about it. From children of those veterans who finally understood why their fathers had been the way they were. From German Americans who had lived through internment and never had their stories told. From ordinary people who needed to believe that kindness could triumph over fear. One letter came from a man in San Antonio. Tom Rodriguez Jr., son of Big Tom, the cook who had taught Wilhelmina to make Texas barbecue. His father had passed away in 1958, but he had kept all of Wilhelmina's recipes handwritten on index cards, stained with flour and butter. He wanted Greta to have them. Another letter came from a woman in Minnesota, Anna Hartman, the girl who had been 14 when she arrived at Camp Hearn, the daughter who had fought with her mother about identity and belonging. She was in her 30s now, a lawyer specializing in civil rights with 2 children of her own. She had never forgotten the chocolate that Liesel had eaten that first morning, the moment when fear had first cracked. And a letter came from an address in Washington, D.C. It was from the family of Captain William Morrison, who had died in 1962 without ever knowing that his experiment in human decency would one day become a book. His daughter wrote that her father had spoken of Camp Hearn often in his final years. He had considered it the most important thing he ever did, more important than any battle or decoration or promotion. He had believed until his last breath that the true measure of a nation was how it treated its enemies. Greta answered every letter. She traveled the country speaking about her experiences, telling the story to audiences who listened with tears in their eyes. She became, in her own quiet way, a witness not just to history, but to possibility. She never forgot the night of the generators. It became the central image of her lectures, the moment she returned to again and again. Because that night contained everything she wanted to say about America, about humanity, about the choices that define us. In the darkness, they could have done anything, she would say, standing before crowds of hundreds, thousands, her voice steady with conviction. No one was watching. No one would have known. The storm was raging. The power was out. They had every excuse to wait until morning to take care of themselves first, to let the German women sit in fear. Instead, they dragged the generator through the mud. They worked in the rain. They brought us light. That is not a small thing. That is everything. That is the choice that separates civilization from barbarism. Not grand gestures or stirring speeches or monuments carved in stone. Just ordinary people in ordinary moments choosing to be decent, when they could choose to be cruel. She would pause then, letting the silence speak. My grandmother carried poison because she believed the Americans were monsters. She was ready to kill herself to kill me rather than face what she thought was coming. And instead of monsters, she found men who gave her chocolate and bacon and a kitchen to bake in. She found friendship with a Mexican Texan cook who lost his son in the Pacific. She found humanity where she expected horror. That is the story of Camp Hearn. That is the story I want you to remember. Greta Richter died on a spring morning in 2003 at the age of 82. She was in her apartment in Manhattan, surrounded by books and photographs and the accumulated treasures of a life well lived. On her windowsill in a small pot grew a tomato plant. It was descended from the seeds that Jimmy Crawford had given her 35 years earlier. Every spring she planted them. Every summer she watched them grow. Every fall she saved the seeds for the following year. Crawford himself had passed away in 1995 at 82 on his ranch in Texas. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his decades as a rancher, his children and grandchildren who continued his legacy. It did not mention Camp Hearn or the German women or the night he helped drag a generator through a storm. Some stories are not told in obituaries. They live in other places, in letters saved in boxes, in recipes written on index cards, in seeds passed from hand to hand across decades, in the memory of those who were there and those who heard the stories and those who will hear them still. The generators hummed through that Texas night in 1945. They brought light to women who expected darkness. They proved that the monsters of propaganda were lies, that the enemy could be human, that strength did not require cruelty. Somewhere in America today, descendants of those generators still run. The electrical grid that powers our homes, our hospitals, our schools, carries within it the echo of that choice. Light instead of darkness. Kindness instead of fear. The revolutionary act of treating enemies as human beings worthy of dignity. This is the inheritance of the greatest generation. Not just victory in battle, but victory over the worst impulses of the human heart. The choice made again and again to be better than we have to be. The next time you flip a switch and light fills a room, remember Camp Hearn. Remember the women in the cellar. Remember Sergeant Crawford and Big Tom and Captain Morrison and all the ordinary Americans who chose to bring light instead of darkness. Remember that the same choice is available to you every day, in every moment. The choice to be kind when you could be cruel. To be generous when you could be selfish. To see the humanity in those you have been taught to fear. That choice is the true meaning of the light. And unlike the generators of Camp Hearn, that light never needs fuel. It only needs you. The darkness did not return. It does not have to return. The choice is ours. Thank you for listening.